Good evening. Before the formal welcome, a few health and safety announcements. The synagogue is fitted with a loop system. If you wish to use it, please switch your devices to the T position. We are not planning to have a fire alarm, so if God forbid the alarm does ring, then it's a real one. Fire exits are in the two corners. Please proceed calmly outside, and when you reach the courtyard, our security officers will direct you to the assembly point. Our security have also asked me to mention that when you leave the building at the end of the evening, please do not congregate outside. Feel free to stay as long as you like, but once you go outside, please keep moving. And finally, for those who are interested, Mara of the evening prayer service will begin 5 minutes after the formal programme ends. The worshipful, the Mayor of Haringey, Sheila Peacock, Rabbis and Rebbitzins, President and Chair of the Synagogue, President and Chief Executive of the United Synagogue, Chair and Trustees of the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre, my lords and ladies, ladies and gentlemen, and as we say in Hebrew, Achrein Achrein Choviv, saving the most treasured until last, our honoured guest, the Right Honourable David Miliband. It is my great privilege to welcome you to Highgate Synagogue for the second Sir Martin Gilbert Memorial Lecture. Sir Martin was such a wonderful person, and he was, and Lady Esther continues to be, such treasured members of this community. As such, it is truly an honour for us to host the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre. Timing was extremely important to Sir Martin. It is evident through his writings, particularly his diaries, and was also very important to him on a personal level. It really used to bother him if he came late to a prayer service, something which I assume bothers everyone. And when it comes to timing, I don't think tonight's talk could have been planned any more perfectly. I suspect that David may have some thoughts on that from a political perspective, but I want to approach it from a very different and personal angle. For tomorrow would have been Sir Martin's 83rd birthday, a milestone which is commonly celebrated as a second bar mitzvah. And we know that he would have loved marking it here, just as he celebrated the 60th anniversary of his bar mitzvah 10 years ago. Sir Martin would have also appreciated the fact that the memorial lecture is taking place in the week we finished the previous cycle of the Torah reading and begin the next one with the Seder of Bereshit of Genesis. The Torah is the ultimate history book, which opens with an account of the creation and then goes on to tell the history of the world through the people who live in it, something Martin was renowned for. And sadly, instead of celebrating his second bar mitzvah, we have the opportunity, and I would suggest the duty, to continue his legacy, to honour his memory, and pass on the values that he represented via this incredible centre. In a few moments, it will be my great pleasure to ask Sir Harry Solomon, our dear, dear friend, and chair of the trustees of the centre, to say a little bit more about the centre. Following that, we are delighted that Lady Esther will introduce our guest of honour. And after the lecture, James Livson, who is also a trustee of the centre, and to whom we owe a huge debt of gratitude for reaching out to David Miliband in the first place, will offer a vote of thanks. Before I close, however, I would like on everyone's behalf to say a huge thank you to Victoria Gordon and Debbie Budwig for their incredible work in organising this evening. Thank you, and without further ado, I give you Sir Harry.
Thank you, Rabbi Liss, for that very warm welcome. I shall be very brief. I suspect I may not be the main event this evening, so I won't keep you long. Thank you for that very warm welcome. And thank you, David, for making the effort. It's a long way to come to give us the second memorial lecture. We're very grateful to you. Thank you. I was a very great friend of Sir Martin Gilbert and a very great admirer of his work. The centre was founded in his memory, but in particular it is to perpetuate his wonderful legacy of making history accessible, enjoyable and relevant. We think it is particularly important in today's volatile and dangerous world that remains so. And Martin, I know, agreed very much with Sir Winston Churchill's maxim that those who ignore history are doomed to repeat it. How true that is. So we try to emulate Martin's legacy, and you will see from the brochure which is with you that we do have an extremely exciting programme of events that I hope many of you will attend and I hope many of you will participate in. I speak from experience. I do go to courses here that Shirley, Professor Gilbert runs, and I assure you they're wonderful, they're stimulating, they're exciting and they're relevant, so I do encourage you. One thing I do want to mention to you, which is very good news, which is we have finalised our agreement with the University College of London, which will enable us to co-host and co-sponsor joint events and programmes with them. This is a significant endorsement of the quality and standard of our work, and it will enhance the scope and level of our activities. Just two further points. On your seats you will see that there is a survey which we would be very grateful if as many of you as possible would fill in, because it helps us with our programmes to know what you, our clients, want. So please fill it in. And finally, the sting is always in the tail. We are a voluntary organisation and we run with charitable contributions. You will also see that there is some space simply to fill in. And if you're prepared to help us, we should be very grateful indeed. Thank you all for coming. David, thank you. Without further ado, Esther, would you like to introduce our guest speaker?
Thank you, Sir Harry, and to our Board of Trustees, whose expertise has added so much to the Learning Centre. As Sir Harry mentioned, we now have a close connection with UCL, and our academic director, Professor of Modern History, Shirley Gilbert, sadly not related, will divide her time between the centre and the university. You will see on your seats, as Sir Harry has mentioned, a brochure that describes some of the upcoming events, and I would like to also thank our director, Victoria Gordon, for the seemingly effortless way she ensures that everything runs smoothly. She is helped, as is the centre, by Debbie Budwig, and a special thank you to Rabbi List, who has been a torchbearer for Martin and a guiding light to us. Mainly, though, we are grateful to all of you, our donors and program participants, for your efforts to support the centre and ensure that it can build on its successes. My lords, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second Sir Martin Gilbert Memorial Lecture, and welcome home to the Right Honourable David Miliband. Some years ago, Martin was invited to the Foreign Office for a candle lighting ceremony to celebrate Hanukkah. As he usually asked if he could bring me along, I was quite miffed when I found out that the invitation did not extend to the wife. So I never got to meet the then Foreign Secretary, David Miliband. It has been a long wait. It was during David Miliband's time in government that he unveiled a plaque in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office to 7 British diplomats who had helped rescue, as the plaque states, victims of Nazi racial policy. Martin had been instrumental in bringing the life-saving activities of these diplomats to light, and described in his pamphlet, Beyond the Call of Duty, how British consular staff were able to help tens of thousands of Jews escape Nazi tyranny. Martin characterizes their rescue efforts as, quote, a high point in the moral progress of mankind. These diplomats must have made a real impression on David Miliband because he became the president and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, based in New York. The IRC responds to humanitarian crises and helps those who have been affected by conflict and disaster. For those of us who are rebuilding families and sanity after the losses of the Second World War, we understand how vital this work is. We have seen how the displaced, the dispossessed, and the traumatized can create fresh conflict and disaster unless they can find security and stability, dignity and hope. We have learned that the breakdown of civility can lead to the breakdown of civilization. David, thank you for coming to speak to us this evening. It's not like there's been much going on the last few years. Hopefully you can give us some insight on how you can gain experience to return to the moral progress of mankind.
Rabbi, thank you so much for the welcome. Sir Harry, thank you. And Esther, I have to offer the most monumental apology. When I say that I believe in the principle of ministerial accountability, that includes the invitations to lighting ceremonies. I am ashamed, appalled, embarrassed, and so it's probably 10, 11, 12 years too late to say how sorry I am. I'm deeply apologetic that it should take me this long to be able to own up or be told of this sin. So really, that is a good note on which to start, isn't it? Now, I want to also acknowledge you, Madam Mayor. Thank you so much for gracing us with your presence here today, and also my colleague as a new MP after 2010, Catherine West, who's the MP for this constituency, is also here, and I want to thank her for being here. As you both intimated, these are extraordinary times by any standards in the UK. There are few cool heads. So we especially miss Sir Martin Gilbert today. And I am especially honoured to have been asked by Esther and by the committee of this wonderful learning centre to give this lecture tonight. Really, it's a privilege to be here for a lecture, but also as the rabbi reminded me, in the tradition of the shul, your job is not just to be quiet, your job is to ask questions as well, so there will be room for argument and conversation as well as for listening in the next hour and a quarter or so. I do want to say that Martin was an extraordinary Briton, a brilliant scholar with an open mind, a historian who thought about the future as well as the past, a writer who dealt in complexity but made things clear, and perhaps especially important at the moment, a patriot who was also an internationalist. Martin only seemed to produce definitive histories: the Second World War and Churchill, Judaism and Israel. And Esther, thank you. You sent me a short essay by Martin on leadership. I think Esther thought I needed some lessons. I can tell you it had, even in a short essay, some gems of insight and humanity. The closest contact I had, and you referred to this, Esther, was in my time as Foreign Secretary. Ziggy Sternberg had the brilliant idea that the diplomats who had bent the rules or broken the rules to rescue or to give visas to Jews to escape from Germany and elsewhere in Europe during the 1930s and 40s should be recognized. These diplomats went way beyond the bounds of government policy, so the work was insubordinate as well as moral. And at the time, the Foreign Office had been incredibly dilatory in recognizing these acts on the grounds that there weren't that many of them. I took the decision that we should recognise them, and in the process of going through the process of establishing a plaque which continues to sit in the old India office today, an absolute bevy of other stories came forward that had never been previously known. Now, the link to Martin is this. I went to Martin before the ceremony to unveil this plaque and asked him for some help with my remarks, which of course he gave in a truly insightful way. But then he went further than that. He wrote this pamphlet that you referred to, whose title, Beyond the Call of Duty, British Diplomats and Other Britons Who Helped Jews Escape from Nazi Tyranny, is so powerful and important. It's on the FCO website. And the pamphlet ends with a very simple lesson. Never underestimate the potential of ordinary people to play their part in defeating evil. In this and other chronicles of the Second World War, Martin Gilbert explained how government of the people, for the people, and by the people was saved for future generations. Not just democracy in the form of majority rule, but the central tenets of liberal democracy. That's what I am going to talk about tonight. The precious nature of the liberal democratic idea. The wrecking ball of Brexit on our democratic norms and institutions. The near miss event of the attempted prorogation of Parliament. And the need for serious renewal of our democracy by all of us as citizens in order to defend our democracy. Not just the place of referendums in our national life, but the use of deliberative forums like citizens' assemblies, the role of a written constitution to keep the monarch out of politics, and protection against the virus of fake news. My starting point for this argument tonight could not be more basic. The liberal idea, with a small l, is that human beings have rights by virtue of their humanity that need to be protected. That there must be defences against the abuse of power, because power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That with rights come responsibilities that need to be exercised in ways large and small to sustain a functioning society. And that while everyone is entitled to their own opinion, they are not entitled to their own facts. So political debate and decision making should proceed in a deliberative form from those facts. This idea has, to my mind, been one of the great liberators of the human story. Alongside its sibling, social democracy, liberal democracy has done more to unleash peaceful human progress than any other idea in history. Now, I say that with a deep breath. I wrote that without realizing I'd be speaking in front of the rabbi. So let me say rather carefully, has done as much to unleash peaceful human progress as any other idea in human history. Otherwise, I may get into a very difficult set of questions from the rabbi later. But I would argue that the liberal idea has freed slaves, emancipated nations, defeated tyrannies, and built civilizations. The free and equal ballot, the rule of law, individual rights are the practical implementation of that liberal idea. They are liberal means, distinct from the goals or ideals that are sometimes called liberal, like social and economic equality between men and women. What I'm talking about tonight are the liberal means that underpin a free society. And my lecture begins, I'm sad, very sad to say, with the chilling fact that these liberal means, the norms and laws of liberal democracy around the world, are under greater challenge than at any time since the Second World War, which Martin Gilbert chronicled so carefully and effectively. I want to read to you the titles of a series of books that have come out over the last 2 years. Excuse me. How Democracies Die. How Democracy Ends. On Tyranny. The Retreat of Western Liberalism. Crises of Democracy. Democracy versus the People. Those have all come out in the last 2 years. Professor Yasha Munk of Johns Hopkins University, he's the author of that latter book, Democracy versus the People, points out in the most recent issue of Foreign Affairs magazine that for the first time since the late 19th century, the cumulative gross domestic product, in other words, the cumulative national income of autocracies now exceeds or equals that of Western liberal democracies. He adds this, quote, "It's been a terrible decade for democracy. According to Freedom House, the world is now in the 13th consecutive year of global democratic recession. Democracies have collapsed or eroded in every region, from Burundi to Hungary, from Thailand to Venezuela. Most troubling of all," he writes, "democratic institutions have proved to be surprisingly brittle in countries that once seemed stable and secure." And the world that we live in today shows the autocrats to be increasingly confident about the way they run their societies. I don't know how many of you had the chance to read the interview that President Putin gave in the Financial Times in June. In it, he stated very boldly, quote, "The liberal idea is obsolete. It has outlived its purpose." You may not be surprised to learn that he also declared that he sees a kindred spirit in a man that he calls Donald. America is central to this story because the United States is a global trendsetter, not just the international weather vane. I see that living and working in New York. The trend I see there is simple but dangerous. The philosophy that the ends justify the means, that breaking the rules is acceptable in the name of your mandate, that norms of checks and balances are not worth defending, that the law is for suckers. Daily, there is evidence of norm breaking on a frankly jaw-dropping scale. And all of this is driven forward by the politics of character assassination in what John Harris, the Guardian columnist, recently called the quote-unquote moronic inferno of Twitter. This brilliant phrase, appropriate enough, is actually the title of a book by Martin Amis. The title was The Moronic Inferno and Other Visits to America. Now, in total, 113 countries, the majority of countries in the world, have seen reduction in democratic freedom since 2006. That means press freedom curtailed, judicial independence curbed, election integrity undermined, freedom of speech reduced. And I want to add this to my prepared remarks. In my work at the International Rescue Committee, which you very kindly referred to, Esther, we see the international version of this democratic recession every day. We have 580 staff in northeast Syria. They see an age of impunity where national borders, the rights of civilians caught up in war, the protection for aid workers is violated every day. We see the consequences of a philosophy that says that the law is for suckers. I'm really proud that Sir John Holmes, who's the chairman of the International Rescue Committee in the UK, and Sam Strickhampton, who's our Senior Vice President for Europe, they're here because I'm speaking in a personal capacity, but the domestic issues that we face in this country and that other countries face around the world have their link to the international work that we do in 40 countries around the world. Now I want to go back to the core argument. The authors of one of the books I referred to, How Democracies Die, are two Harvard University academics, Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt. And they argue there are two unwritten rules that sustain democracy. The first is mutual toleration, according to which politicians accept their opponents as loyal citizens and legitimate representatives of views with which you happen to disagree, but which nonetheless are legitimate. You cannot have the civility that Esther referred to rightly if you consider your opponents not just misguided, but somehow dangerous and illegitimate. The second norm is forbearance, or self-restraint in the exercise of power. Because you accept that the other side may one day be in power, and fear what they would do with untrammeled power, you limit your own use of power. That's why norms are so important. Levitsky and Ziblatt describe the opposite of forbearance as exploiting the letter of the law to undermine its spirit. Mark Tushner, who's another professor at Harvard, he calls this constitutional hardball. So whoever it was who referred to the timing of this lecture was more right than they may have even guessed. Because constitutional hardball inevitably brings us to what I would call the trauma of Brexit that is currently being argued out in this country at the moment. Constitutional hardball, quote unquote, has been the hallmark of the last two governments in the UK, notably in trying to keep Parliament out of the Brexit negotiations. And that makes Brexit the anvil for the British version of the challenge to liberal democratic norms and institutions. Now, I want to start by recognizing something really important. I referred to the 113 countries that have had a reduction in democratic freedom since 2006. That's organized by a think tank called Freedom House. The UK scored 93 out of 100 in the last annual assessment of political freedom conducted by Freedom House. We are lucky to be citizens of a country that is so marked by its degree of political openness, its political stability, its fidelity to constitutional norms and values. But I would argue, precisely because we are lucky, we have to be on our guard. That assessment was done before the events of the last year. The norms, institutions, parties, practices and trust our democracy lives by, I believe, are patently being challenged by the Brexit crisis. And here I want to go back to Martin Gilbert. Professor Richard Evans was not only Martin Gilbert's last undergraduate pupil before Martin took on the job of being Churchill's biographer. Richard Evans was also a speaker at Martin's memorial service in 2015, and he is, of course, one of Britain's most foremost historians. So when he writes an article for Prospect magazine entitled, quote-unquote, Britain's Reichstag fire moment, and I see that at Heathrow Airport, I cannot help but be shocked. The danger, of course, is to be alarmist, and it's easy to be dismissed for being alarmist. My dad always said to me, if you were ever in an argument and you end up praying an aid in the 1930s, you've lost the argument. But there's a danger too in ignoring the alarms. Professor Evans says this, he says we are not reliving the 1930s. But he also says this, the ground rules of democratic politics in many countries, including Britain and the US, are more in danger than they've been at any time since the 1930s. Brexit, to my mind, has not just come to symbolise the shifting ground rules of which Professor Evans writes. It's also shifted those rules. It's a cause as well as symptom when it comes to the challenge to the sovereignty of Parliament, the nature of political debate, the role of the courts, the unity of the parties, the rule of law, and even the role of the monarch. So it's fundamental. And I want to come back to that crisis, but before I do so, I want to just lay my cards on the table with a personal detour. I am not a dispassionate observer of the, well, I'm an observer, but not a dispassionate one, of this Brexit crisis. And I freely confess that the Brexit crisis has been something akin to a journey through the 7 stages of hell for me. Stage 1, worry. I spoke in the referendum campaign, including at a disastrously ill-fated event at the British Museum with David Cameron, where he spent the time, instead of arguing about how the European Union supported our role in the world, he had to explain away a completely stupid briefing about Brexit delivering World War III, quote unquote. By the time I campaigned in Birmingham in June 2016, I had that deep worry that comes to any of the politicians here who feel a campaign lacks energy, lacks values, and lacks momentum. Stage 2, distress. the referendum result and its aftermath. I said this to someone upstairs, I honestly felt like I'd lost part of myself. Not an arm or a leg, but something in my bloodstream. And not just because my mum was born in Poland and my dad was born in Belgium. I knew that European Union membership had helped make the Britain that I loved so much. The opportunities, the people, the culture, the cooperation, the influence. I knew that from my time in office. Now we were going into reverse. Stage 3 of the 7 stages of hell, incredulity. In 2016, Theresa May went to the Conservative Party conference and sailed right into the Bermuda Triangle of commitments to leave the customs union, leave the single market, and simultaneously deliver frictionless trade between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Impossible. Crazy. Destined to lead to disaster. Stage 4. Foreboding. The triggering of Article 50 in 2017. And I want to tell you a story about why I felt this terrible sense of foreboding when the House of Commons voted across parties. Both parties supported the triggering of Article 50 in 2017. I was the Minister, the Foreign Secretary, who took the Lisbon Treaty through Parliament. The Lisbon Treaty contained Article 50. For the first time, the European Union made provision for a country to leave. And I promise you, I remember, in my office on King Charles Street, saying to the Civil Service Bill team the following: surely the 2-year guillotine after the triggering of Article 50 means that all the cards are held by the European Union after a country does that. And they said to me a very simple answer: don't worry, Foreign Secretary. Everyone across Europe is clear that no country in its right mind would start the clock until it has sorted out a package with which it was going to leave. That's foreboding. Stage 5, despair. The Labour leadership's jobs first Brexit in 2018. A vain hope at best and a deception at worst. The only jobs in a jobs first Brexit are jobs for Holland, France and Germany. And please don't get me going on neutrality between remain and leave. Stage 6, embarrassment. Living in New York, the same conversation with every American I meet. Some of you have had this experience. A shaking of the head. The lament that a country they know as pragmatic and stable is normalizing zealous. And then the big American smile, the repeated phrase. They say, but thank you. Thank you because your country is in even worse trouble than ours. Now I have to interrupt your laughter and I have to interrupt their laughter and say, it's not funny. It's serious. But they do say that. This leads to stage 7, frustration. Frustration at the same arguments being recycled again and again. That there are glittering trade deals waiting to be signed with the rest of the world. There are. That customs checks between Great Britain and Northern Ireland don't represent a border. They do. And most egregiously, that anything currently under discussion will get Brexit, quote unquote, done. It won't. Sir Ivan Rogers, who was a tremendous civil servant, he worked for me when I was in the Foreign Office, he was the permanent representative, the ambassador to the European Union. He's made clear, Brexit is a process, not an event. If we leave the EU, we will be doing Brexit, negotiating the consequences, making up for it, filling in the gaps, for at least the next Parliament, and most likely well beyond. And if I'm frustrated now, I shudder at what those convinced that Brexit can be done this week will come to think when they realise that it won't. The truth is that Brexit is going to be our test, not just economically and politically, but democratically. And the story of the Brexit crisis, its misbegotten origins, its chaos, its lies, its danger to the very existence of the United Kingdom, can only have a silver lining if it triggers a series of changes to strengthen our democracy in the face of internal and external threats. And I really struggled to find a way of making this lecture more than a dirge. But I felt a responsibility not simply to tell you what was wrong, but also how we can turn this division that has split families, never mind the country, into something positive. And that's what I want to try and do in the rest of my remarks tonight, at least to have us going away from here, thinking about what we can do after the crisis, not just how we got here. Here's my take on it. It's not enough, excuse me, it's not enough to bemoan populism. We who treasure the liberal democratic settlement and the freedoms it ensures, we need to get our act together. If you're in that group, we've got some hard work to do. We need to be honest, we need to be vigilant, we need to be zealous, creative, and persuasive. Much more creative, persuasive, zealous than we've been in the last 3 years. The honesty starts by acknowledging the strongest point that those who support Brexit now have on their side. The best point they've got, I would argue the only point they've got, is that since people voted to leave in June 2016, and since Parliament voted to trigger Article 50 in 2017, we need to go ahead with Brexit, whatever the economic or political cost, because the danger to democratic health and confidence will be so great if we don't. This is what the Times newspaper said last month, and it sums up this argument. Failure to do so, to leave now, would do more than weaken popular trust in government. It would fatally undermine the social contract on which parliamentary democracy depends. It's a serious point. The Chancellor, actually, this isn't a serious point, but he has said it. The Chancellor, Sajid Javid, has recently said he doesn't need to do an economic impact assessment of the plan that is now in front of Parliament because, and I quote, passing it is good for the fabric of our democracy. That's the argument. I believe this argument needs to be joined. I believe the counter-argument that the democratic dangers of Brexit at any cost are in fact greater than the undoubted risk of failing to leave by October the 31st is stronger. This is the counter-argument. It can't be that the referendum should never have been held, even if I think it shouldn't. Nor can it be that the result should somehow be annulled, the so-called revoke position. Anti-liberal measures cannot be used to defend liberal institutions. A revocation without a referendum would not be democratic. You can't just undo the referendum result like that. The counter-argument, I believe, has to go as follows. It cannot be more democratic to plough on with a version of Brexit that was never presented to the public in 2016 than to consult them on whether they want to go ahead with the plan. I would argue that the risks to democratic health of going ahead are greater than allowing the public to decide, especially when the plan doesn't represent the end of Brexit, and doubly so when passing it does not even begin to scratch the surface of the democratic renewal that we need. And now I want to come to this near-miss event. The World Health Organization, it's a medical term. Professor, I'm embarrassed to be, I don't need to tell Lord Winston that it's a medical event, but the World Health Organization defines a near-miss event as an error with the potential for patient harm that is intercepted before it's too late. I honestly want to say this to you in the most sincere and serious way, and I would like you to think about it. We had a near-miss event in August with the attempted prorogation of Parliament. In this case, the patient was our democratic system. The error was in the use of the royal prerogative. And it took the intervention of the Supreme Court to enable Parliament to do its job. We've had our warning, in other words. Near misses in medicine represent a teachable moment. The forestalled prorogation of Parliament had been many years in the making, and it will take a 10-year process at least to renew our democratic health. But that, I believe, is what is needed, across parties and beyond parties. My argument is that the whole process of the referendum and its aftermath need to be the catalyst for far-reaching change. I don't pretend to you at all that I have the answers or all the answers tonight, but I do think it's a central question. And there are three things that I think we have to talk about. First, we need to recognise what the evidence tells us. Significant numbers of voters, citizens, say they want to blow up the system. And where there are enough voters, there will be politicians ready to follow them. I don't often spend my time doing this, but the prize-winning paper in the psychology section of this year's American Political Science Association meeting in September delivered a truly extraordinary statistic. 40% of American voters, what were called chaos voters, are ready to concur that social and political institutions of the country need to be, quote-unquote, torn down. These are the voters who spread false rumours on social media, not to support one candidate or the other, but to prove that the whole system is wrong. I'm sorry to say, an analysis of the British electorate, based on analysis of ideology, using admittedly older data, found a similar proportion of what the study called anarchist voters. These are voters who avowedly believe the system has let them down. And the response, I would argue, to this can be disagreement, but it cannot be disdain. Levels of inequality, the reality of rent-seeking at the top, the abuse of power by the powerful, the perception of existential cultural change, are real facts that threaten our system of government. In the US, this really was astonishing to me. It was revealed that the 400 richest families pay the lowest rate of tax of any group in the population. Who can say that that is not a situation that deserves to incite anger? The American political scientist Adam Pajolsky makes the simple point well. Quote, political equality coexists uneasily with a system of economic inequality. So the defense of our democracy needs to be built on a renewed social and economic contract. It's right, in my view, that the taxation of wealth is rising up the political agenda, that the abuse of economic power is doing the same, that life chances in towns so-called left behind, towns like the one I represented in South Shields, and I'll be there tomorrow, it's right that those towns are the focus of debate. If the Brexit crisis doesn't spur serious rethinking, then it will truly be a crisis gone to waste. These aren't just economic debates. They're fundamental to our democracy. Second, our representative democracy needs a reboot. And I just want to make 3 points in this area. One is about referendums. I don't think we should abolish them, but they need to be put in their place. I spent 3 years as Foreign Secretary quoting 2 Prime Ministers, Attlee and Thatcher, who both said, referendums are the refuge of dictators and demagogues. And the cavalier way in which the 2016 referendum was organised, a rush job with no explanation, no engagement of citizens before the campaign, no real-time rebuke for law-breaking around campaign finance, only compounded the danger. So one silver lining of the Brexit crisis would be to put the role and conduct of referendums on an appropriate footing, just as an absolute basic. You never have a referendum without an actual proposal, a detailed proposal of what people are voting on. Second, deliberative democracy. Rory Stewart suggested this in The Citizen, suggested that proposals for citizens' assembly should be used to inform the Brexit debate during the Conservative leadership contest. He was only learning from Ireland. Ireland took 2 of the most conceivably divisive issues you could have in a Catholic country, abortion and gay rights, and they ensured that 2 referenda didn't become a huge cleavage in the country. They became actually a process of citizen discussion and education, so that the losers in the referendum, as well as the winners, thought there was legitimacy to the result. My former colleague, Matthew Taylor, he's now the president of the Royal Society of Arts, he's made concrete proposals about how to use citizens' assemblies. 100 people brought from around the country, brought together for local issues, national issues, to tackle the problems of blunt mandate and solidarity deficit associated with our winner-takes-all political system. He says, and I think he's right, that this is the way you take on the syndrome that politics becomes 24-hour kickboxing. Now, I said to someone in America last week, politics is becoming 24-hour kickboxing. He said, no, it's cage fighting, there aren't any rules. So we should beware. And I just want to bring to your attention something really interesting and in fact quite inspiring. 2 Stanford professors, Fishkin and Diamond, ran an experiment called America in One Room. And it speaks to this idea of what happens when citizens actually talk to each other. 523 Americans representing the whole country, young and old, all ethnic groups, gathered for a weekend in Dallas to discuss the most toxic political issues. Immigration, healthcare, the economy, environment, foreign policy. What happened? It's not surprising, really. There was a move against polarization. This is interesting. the percentage of Republicans supporting reducing the number of refugees allowed to resettle in America fell from 66% to 34% in the course of a weekend. Democrats became more sober about the level of the minimum wage and levels of government spending. I don't know how popular this will be in this audience, but international engagement, 2/3 of Republicans started supporting the Iran nuclear deal. There was a change from the mid-40% to 2/3 of them. So deliberative democracy, bringing citizens into the conversation, has positive effects. I also have to say this about the reboot of our political system. We have a 20th century class-based party structure which is struggling to cope with the 21st century demands of identity politics that are pressed on it by Brexit. The party system is based on the idea that broad church parties can represent coalitions of interest. But when the churches become sects, the system breaks down. That danger is now staring us in the face. It's one reason why many people fear the next election. In the short term, there's going to be, and needs to be, tactical voting on a grand scale. Our electoral system has always required voters to balance head and heart in the interests of stable government. But that is now not being delivered. The extremes are being strengthened. Around the world, multi-party systems, based on more proportional systems than ours, are increasingly the norm, reflecting fragmented electorates and building compromise into government by the mechanism of coalition negotiations. Interestingly, far from being behind closed doors, these coalition negotiations are increasingly public in most countries. And it will be as well to recognise our diversity of opinion, in my view, in the electoral system in Britain as well. And third and lastly, I want to talk about how we defend the foundations of our liberties in two areas. One in respect of the judiciary, and the other in respect of the war on facts, which is what fake news represents. We'll start with the role of the courts. These are not the quote-unquote enemies of the people. They are not mounting a constitutional coup when they do their work. They're actually the defenders of the rights of the people. One feature of the last few months that I found especially interesting is that for the first time since its creation, the Supreme Court has entered the national consciousness. The televising of the prorogation case was all to the good. And apparently 4 million people watched some or all of the proceedings. The key is the independence from politics, which the 2005 creation of the Supreme Court by Charlie Faulkner worked so assiduously and successfully to achieve. One of the Supreme Court justices, I quoted this to the rabbi before we came down, Lord Hodge, speaking in November 2018, made this point, quote, "Judicial decisions which have political consequences are not the same as political decisions." How right? It would be retrograde in the extreme to subject judicial appointments to political judgment. Still less to have judges running for office as they do in the US. But we need to do more than fend off the clammy hands of politics. Lord Hodge has set out a checklist of 10 pillars that support the independence of the judiciary, including but not limited to the appointments process, security of tenure, thoroughgoing commitment of judges to extend public understanding. They all make sense. And speaking for myself, I think the Brexit saga enormously strengthens the case for Britain to make a serious, multi-year attempt to agree the ground rules of politics through a written constitution. Such a constitution would not end the argument about the balance between politicians and the judiciary, but it could force national engagement with the foundations of our freedom. And it would do one other thing, which I just want to refer to briefly. It would end once and for all the multiple opportunities for abuse associated with the royal prerogative. I'm sure that many of you in this room were disturbed by the questions raised by the government's decision to prorogue Parliament. One particularly unseemly part of that process concerned the role of Her Majesty the Queen. There should never have been a question of the Queen being asked to sign an illegal request from government. A written constitution would formalise the removal of the monarch from politics in a healthy way. Now, I want to come on to my last point, which I have to say deserves a whole lecture, but you can be relieved to know that I won't get one tonight. It's about the war on facts that I see being waged by enemies, external and internal. The war, this need to fight the war on facts means more than calling out and pushing back against the bullying, intimidation and demonization of politicians and of journalists, especially women journalists and politicians, which is such a distressing feature of our political discourse. The BBC's Laura Kuenssberg is doing her job. She reports the news, she reports the attempts to shape the news, she tries to help us understand what's happening underneath the bonnet of the car. We should all be protesting the attacks on her and other journalists as much as we deplore and protest the attacks on MPs. We also, and this is where it gets even more interesting, I think, we need to defend the rules on balance. I see such a difference between news as broadcast in Britain and news as broadcast in the US, because we have rules on balance here in the Broadcasting Act. We need to defend the rules on balance that are a feature of broadcasting here, and that cannot be confined to the traditional broadcasting. Think about any of your children and grandchildren. They don't get their news from the 10 o'clock news. They get it on their phone. And there's a healthy debate now about whether and how social media companies should be classified as publishers, and therefore subject to the laws of libel. But we also need to address their role as broadcasters, because that's what they are now. It's a debate which has exploded into public view in the US recently. I don't know how many of you have followed this. The Trump campaign put together a campaign advert attacking the Biden family, riddled with lies. CNN refused to screen it on the grounds of its demonstrably false, quote-unquote, claims. But in stepped Facebook to take the ad. You're not allowed to lie in advertising for medicine or for food. Why should you be allowed to lie in promoting your politics? Facebook's fact-checking rules explicitly exclude political lies. They justify the decision to broadcast lies on the grounds of free speech and fair debate. Mark Zuckerberg gave a speech last week at Georgetown University. He said he was defending the liberties that allowed Martin Luther King to lead the civil rights movement. The King family replied that it was hateful speech that generated the forces that eventually killed their father. As it happens, there have been studies which show that few of the Facebook feeds receiving the Biden ad were getting any counterweight. So the idea that we can rely on democratic debate to root out truth from falsehood, good ideas from bad ones, is not convincing. I think there are two objective tests. Is the material demonstrably false? And is the originator a legitimate organisation or real person? Because remember, a lot of these ads aren't coming from people or organisations. That puts me with the writer Anne Applebaum. I don't know how many of you have read her Pulitzer Prize-winning work. She, in a way, is a historian in the tradition of Martin Gilbert. She writes this: the question now is to find the equivalent of licensing and public broadcasting in the world of social media, to find the regulatory or social or legal measures that will make this technology work for us rather than against us. We can, for example, regulate internet advertising, just as we regulate broadcast advertising, insisting that people know when and why they're being shown political ads. We can curb the anonymity of the internet because we have a right to know whether we're interacting with real people or with bots. And there was a recent ruling, James, you'll know more about it than I do, of the European Court of Justice on defamatory content. So this debate is coming here. My view is it should come to politics before it comes to the law. And fake news is only going to get worse with the rise of deep fakes. I don't know how many of you have seen the purported speech by Nancy Pelosi. It's a speech with Nancy Pelosi speaking, but it wasn't her who gave the speech. It's pure fake. It's terrifying. Now, there is, as always, if one looks hard enough, you can find someone who's finding at least part of the answer. And it comes from an unlikely source. Finland. Finland categorizes misinformation, which is mistakes, from disinformation, which are hoaxes, from malinformation, which is gossip. And it has taken more seriously than any other country the need to arm citizens with the tools to beat back fake news. The slogan is really interesting. Quote, "The fight against fake news starts in the kindergarten. They train teachers, they educate students to take seriously the difference between truth and lies and between facts and opinion. Interestingly enough, Finnish students consistently beat out American students and British students in their ability to identify the reliability and veracity of news articles and social media posts. Significantly higher scoring. So there is a hope. However, there's one big snag in the Finnish approach which may appall or amuse you. Older internet users, 50 plus, can't imagine who they're thinking of, or 65 plus, are significantly worse at spotting fake news and are significantly more likely to share fake news than younger internet users. Facebook users, this is an extraordinary statistic, Facebook users over 65 years old shared nearly 7 times as many articles from fake news sites as younger users. Age, not politics, is the biggest predictor of who shares fake news. Which is to say that educating future generations won't fix our problem. We need to get parents and grandparents into these fake news classes as well. That just goes to show that on their own, none of these changes are the silver bullet. But together, they would constitute a determined effort at refounding and renewing our democracy for future generations. So, no, Mr. Putin, the liberal idea is not obsolete. It's more necessary than ever. But it will not survive unless it is defended. I was taught at university that civil rights of the 18th century were buttressed by political rights in the 19th century, and that the 20th century was the century of social rights. T.H. Marshall had a very famous book called Citizenship and Social Class. It was the Whig theory of history marked by ineluctable progress. If only that story that I was taught in the 1980s were true. If only there was one direction to history. Autocracies do become democracies. But it's foolish to ignore the scope for democratic backsliding. Just ask the people of Hungary. And to avoid backsliding, we need to strengthen our democratic institutions, which is why I've dedicated my remarks tonight to that topic. We are lucky. We do have strong guardrails against the abuse of power. But they are now challenged in a way that has not been the case before, internally and externally. And the evidence from the US and elsewhere is that when they are not defended, they are eroded. The Brexit crisis is about far more than Brexit. On this, the Brexiteers are right. It's about our identity, our place in the world, but it's also about our democracy. If only it were true, Brexit is not done, nor is the damage that it's going to do. And so we need to seize every opportunity, in my view, to limit its baleful influence on institutions bequeathed to us by generations of struggle. Martin Gilbert did not just document those struggles, he believed in them, and I think we should too. Thank you very much indeed.
David has very kindly agreed to take some questions, and we have had some questions submitted, so I'm just going to call out some names of people, and we'll take as many as we can in the time available. Michael Marks.
Slightly change the subject, but given the momentum's grip on the Labour Party, slight change of subject, but given the momentum's grip on the Labour Party at the moment, do you ever see your old party coming back to centrist politics?
So I recognise, as much as I deplore the validity of the question, what I would say to you is that the Labour Party that I know remain, and I am still a member of it, remains full of the most extraordinarily idealistic, committed, pluralistic, non-sectarian people. The trouble is they're not in positions of power in the Labour Party. Now, I do not believe that sectarianism is the route to government, and so I think that it is really important that I recognise the extraordinary efforts that are going on by people whose politics are in no way sectarian to sustain the Labour Party as a force that is able to hold majority support in the country. And maybe I should just anticipate this, because it would be wrong not to expect a question in this regard. For someone like me, who it never occurred to me when I was Foreign Secretary that people were looking at me and saying, he's a Jewish Foreign Secretary. Never occurred to me that when I was speaking, it was my religion that was in the front of people's minds rather than the positions I was articulating. So, you haven't asked it, but maybe you were just being diplomatic. Is it painful that the words Labour Party and anti-Semitism are in the same sentence, headline, paragraph, article? Yes, it is. It's very painful. And does it worry me about the future of the party as one part of the syndrome that you're talking about? Yes, it does. And there's no question that the party's become a magnet for some people with some utterly repulsive views over the last 3 years. And it's become, and it's not done enough to root them out and make sure they never come back. But I also know that the people I will see, who are, by the way, the event I'm doing in South Shields tomorrow is across parties. It's not a Labour Party event, but I know that the Labour Party members who I meet tomorrow night in South Shields, they're not going to be looking at me as a Jewish ex-MP. They're going to be looking at me as someone who was their MP. And I want to hold on to that, but the battle needs to be joined. And so I think my responsibility is to support those who I know are working so hard at the front line. And as long as Margaret Hodge is in the Labour Party fighting to uphold the best of the Labour tradition, then I feel it's incumbent on me to be there as well.
Janine Strain.
It's getting hot in here, isn't it?
I was wondering with Bibi Netanyahu's, Bibi Netanyahu not being voted out, if there was more hope for peace between Israel and Palestinians.
Whose idea was it to take non-controversial questions? At least you know that the questions weren't vetted in advance.
They were, that wasn't the question. Janine was
I mean, look, it would be stupid to get into the personalities on this. Put it this way, I spent 3 years as Foreign Secretary talking about not just a two-state solution, but a 23-state solution. Talking about an Israel securing its borders, but also but at peace with the rest of the Arab world. I think it's so hard now to sustain. I try in the depth of me not to give up on it. But I worry deeply that young Palestinians who might have been the Salam Fayeds of the 20 years' time are no longer thinking about a two-state solution. They're thinking about a one-state solution. And so I'm not plugged in enough to know what's possible, what's not possible. What I can observe is that the issue referred to hardly featured in the election campaign. And that's quite an interesting indicator.
and hopefully one of our younger attendees will stick to the script. Oliver Adler.
Hi. If a Brexit deal does pass, do you believe that Scotland would be deserving of a second independence referendum? And if you were Scottish, how would you vote on that?
And that's easy because I'm very strongly committed to the idea that the UK is strong because it's all the nations of the UK together. And I believe that internationally, but I also believe it nationally. I don't want to say if I was Scottish, because in a way it's slightly, it can seem the wrong way of answering it, but I understand why you're asking the question. And there's a very good article actually today in the Evening Standard by Jonathan Powell, who was my colleague in Downing Street after 1997. He was the chief negotiator of the shuttle diplomacy between 1997 and 2007 in Northern Ireland, and knows his Irish politics and Northern Irish politics very well. And he makes an interesting point, which is, don't just think about the consequences of this Brexit proposal for Northern Ireland, which he believes are severe. And last night, I don't know how many people saw this, the Chief Constable of Northern Ireland weren't warned about a border in the Irish Sea, meaning a return to so-called loyalist violence. Loyalist paramilitary organisation. That's not me, that's the Chief Constable of Northern Ireland. But Jonathan's article is important because he points out, not about another Scottish referendum, but about what does the quote-unquote special deal for Northern Ireland mean for arguments about the deal that's offered to Scotland. And that's why I really worry about the integrity of our country being torn, pulled apart. So I think it's a real, I think it's a real risk. I think it's the best way of asking your thing. I don't know what will happen. I think there are big arguments against it, but I can see why the current Brexit proposal will be exploited in that way.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question. John Gilbert?
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
John Gilbert?
Yeah.
Behind you, just behind you.
What are the chances, David, of your coming back to this country?
Look, I feel very lucky. I'm someone who had an incredible privilege to work in politics and in government. And I feel an incredible privilege to be someone who is an ex-politician who's now able to do something that speaks to my values, that gives me a sense of agency. I mean, we're an institution that was founded by Einstein to rescue Jews from Europe, and today we're working in 40 countries around the world, in 200 field sites for people who are fleeing from persecution and danger. So I feel an enormous sense of privilege about that, and I feel a strong sense of responsibility for the people who today are working for me. I mean, yesterday I was in Nairobi, and the staff meeting that we had in there, and the visits that I did to see what we're doing for Ethiopian, Congolese, South Sudanese refugees gave me an enormous sense of privilege and pride. Equally, I always say, and this is not a great answer, I freely admit, I don't know what I'm going to do next, but I know what the test is. And the test is, where do I think I can make most difference for the things I believe in? And I don't know how often Karl Marx gets mentioned in this forum, but one of the less controversial things that Karl Marx said was that man makes his own history, but not as he chooses. And we all have to make the best of the circumstances that we find ourselves in. And I think it's really important that I try and apply that lens to thinking about how I can make the most difference. So that's not an answer, of course.
Practice that. We have got time for some more questions. I'll take some questions from the floor. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Madeleine Cohen. I wanted to ask you a question actually about what you spoke about today. It was about the written constitution. Now, I do kind of like a written constitution, but I think it's very, very dangerous, because when you see what happens in America, especially with a view to gun control, and the way they talk about the right to bear arms, and how they try to make it sound so fantastic, and it's in the written constitution, and therefore we all have to agree with it. I would like to know how you would suggest we could avoid that in a written constitution, because frankly, I don't know how you can, because get all clever lawyers like you, maybe, to say, well, actually what they meant to say was X, Y, and Z. How do you stop that?
Yeah, so look, it's an important question, it's a real question. Two parts of the answer. The first is, remember, the right to bear arms that was written 250 years ago is not a right for every individual to bear arms. So it's been traduced by a range of other aspects of it. Secondly, there's no requirement for a written constitution to tell you that you've got the right to bear arms. There are hundreds of constitutions around the world that don't give the right to bear arms. And I freely admit it's a very difficult process to start. It has to be, you have to set a constitution that you hope will last for a significant period of time is a sobering enterprise. But look, this may sound like a ridiculous comparison, but I don't think it is. I just came back from Kenya. They had to rewrite their constitution after 2008, because there was violence after the election. They're going to find their test because it wrote in that no president should stand for more than 2 terms. And I don't believe it's impossible to write a constitution if you do it in a way that engages the citizenry, that is a process of refounding of a real moral and political seriousness, that does engage every school in the country, that engages every community in the country, born out of a sense that we have a duty to do what Lincoln called the most difficult job of anyone. The most difficult job is to be a citizen. And to be a citizen is to think hard about how your society should be organised and to play your part in structuring that society. And I honestly believe, I see the risks of going down the written constitution road, but I think the risks of not doing so were evident in this near miss that we had this summer. So that's the argument.
Actually, really partly answered the question. You partly answered the question I was going to ask, but if you look at the American Constitution, it took over 20 years to write that Constitution and required repeated alteration before it became reasonably settled. And the problem we've got is an urgent situation, so your silver bullet is not one that's easy to fire.
No, it's not a silver bullet, and it doesn't address today's problem. I mean, this is about not just an insurance policy, but it's about a rededication to the principles that our unwritten constitution is supposed to be based on. And I don't see it as the answer to today's problem. It's an answer to the day after tomorrow's problem. And if you take seriously the threats that I've described, and there are many threats that I didn't have the time to even talk about, the threats to our democracy that come from within and without, I think we're duty-bound to think, what's the insurance policy? It remains the case in countries with written constitutions that run those risks of the democratic recession that I quoted, but it also is incumbent on us to think about it really hard. And I hope that, as I said, I don't at all believe I've got the answers, but I think it is the right question. And unless we take our democracy seriously, then it's going to be eroded. It doesn't mean there'll be people with military uniforms reading out the news, but it means an erosion from that 93 out of 100 that I talked about. And it seems to me that we have a duty, having inherited that 93 out of 100, to make sure that it's passed on. And that's really the essence of what I was trying to say. I think that's a good note.
So it falls on me to thank David, and I've known David for 15 years, and for me it's been a hugely enriching friendship and one that I treasure. And I think that I and many others here tonight and in our country have missed you over the last 6 years, while you and Louise and the boys have been in New York. Quite how much we've missed you has been illustrated by a fantastic, thought-provoking and ultimately slightly optimistic speech tonight. And we're profoundly grateful for you for being here. Your words have shone a light on the depressing, intractable, terrifying issues of our day, and perhaps distance has assisted that clarity. Many of us would have traded the clarity of your observations for your direct participation. But yesterday's dreadful news is a sharp reminder that your current work is far more important than sorting out our political paralysis. Your contribution has saved or improved hundreds of thousands of lives of the most vulnerable people in the world, and we don't need to be in a synagogue to recognise the sanctity of that. It is work that Sir Martin would surely have applauded, as enthusiastically as he would have applauded your words this evening. So thank you very much for being here. We really, really appreciate it.